The shocking truth about humanity: they were never prey, only predators. The grip nearly broke my wrist. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the smell of their station, not the strange flat lighting they preferred, not even the odd way they moved, heavy, deliberate, like every step was a small act of intention. It was the grip. Ambassador Yara Solis extended her hand and closed her fingers around mine, and something small shifted in my secondary wrist joint with a sound I hope she did not hear. She smiled. I smiled back. And in that moment, standing in the entry corridor of humanity's orbital station above a blue and green world, I told myself it meant nothing. A cultural gesture. Harmless. I was Zail Rin, senior observer for the Galactic Council, and I had been sent here because this was supposed to be easy. The briefing the Council gave me 3 weeks earlier had been thorough and completely wrong, though I would not understand that for some time. The report described humans as a Category 2 species, emerging, developing, pre-galactic in all meaningful ways. Small bodies. Short lives. Dependent on a single oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere. Limited space capability. Emotional and unpredictable in their decision-making. The Council had seen species like this dozens of times. They bloomed briefly, made contact, accepted trade terms and a protection arrangement, and then settled quietly into the larger order of things. My job was to be pleasant, offer the arrangement, and come home with signatures. I walked deeper into the station and tried to read the space the way I had been trained. A species architecture tells you almost everything. The corridors here were narrow by galactic standards, built for bodies that were not large but moved with confidence. There were no decorative panels, no soft ambient displays of art or natural imagery the way most new contact species preferred. The walls were functional. The lighting was practical. Every surface had a purpose. It reminded me, faintly, of a working vessel rather than a welcome center. Yara Solis walked beside me with her hands clasped behind her back. She was not small by human standards, I had been told. Medium height, lean, with dark eyes that moved in small quick arcs, cataloging everything around her with the same quiet efficiency I used to catalog her. I realized, after about 40 seconds of walking, that she had already clocked every member of my 4-person delegation. She had noted our body language, our spacing, which of us looked at the ceiling and which at the floor. She had done all of this while maintaining perfect, warm conversation about the docking approach and whether we had found the atmospheric pressure comfortable. I filed this observation under curiosity rather than concern. That was my first mistake. She led us to a reception chamber where a long table had been set with food, human food, which I was not expected to eat, but which she had clearly arranged as a gesture of hospitality. 3 other humans stood near the table. 2 men and 1 woman, and they introduced themselves in the same easy way Yara had. Firm hands. Direct eyes. Names offered without ceremony. Neil Hartley. Grace Adler. Owen Parrish. I catalogued them the same way I catalogued all new contacts: rank, likely function, body language. Grace Adler was watching my secondary limbs with the focused attention of someone solving an engineering problem. I made a note of this. I did not yet know what to do with it. Saturday Yara poured water for herself from a simple metal container and offered some to my delegation. The meeting began in a relaxed, professional tone. The Council's standard introduction, delivered by my aide, covering the history of galactic contact, the protection framework, the trade model, and the gentle expectation of alignment with Council norms. It was a speech designed to feel generous. It had worked 47 times. Yara listened with total stillness. She did not shift in her chair. She did not look at her colleagues for reassurance. She did not take notes. She simply watched my aide deliver the speech, and when it was finished, she said, quietly and without any change in expression, "We would like to review the terms in full before we agree to anything. We would also like to understand the exact nature of the protection you are offering. Specifically, who decides when it applies, and who decides when it ends." My aide paused. This was not the usual first question. The usual first question was about trade routes or communication technology. "Those decisions rest with the Council," my aide said. "And who sits on the Council?" "Representatives from the 11 founding species, with advisory voices from the 12 associate members. And humans would be considered associate members if we accepted this arrangement." "Initially, yes." Yara nodded once, slowly. So we would be accepting protection from a body we have no real voice in, under terms we had no part in writing, enforced by a framework we have not reviewed. She was not being hostile. Her tone was calm, almost friendly. But the question sat in the air of the room like something heavy had been placed very carefully on the table. "It is the standard arrangement," my aide said. "I understand," Yara said. "We will still need to review it." I looked at her hands, folded on the table in front of her. Steady. Completely steady. And I thought of the grip in the corridor, and I thought of how far from home I was, and I thought, for just a moment, that maybe this species was going to be a little more interesting than the briefing had suggested. After the meeting, as a gesture of good faith, Yara offered to share something she called a brief history package. It was, she explained, a curated selection of human historical records. Educational. Context for understanding where they had come from. The council had done something similar for us. It seemed like a fair exchange. I opened the package that evening in my assigned quarters aboard the station. I closed it 50 minutes later. I sat in the dim room for a long time after that, looking at the blank wall, processing what I had seen. Not the details were almost too numerous to absorb in one session. What stopped me was the pattern. The shape of it. Every few generations, for as far back as their records went, humans had encountered something that should have ended them. Drought on a scale that collapsed ecosystems. Cold periods that swallowed their early settlements. Disease that spread across continents before they had any understanding of disease at all. Resource collapse. Rival groups. Catastrophic internal conflicts that mobilized enormous portions of their total population. And every single time, without exception, what followed was not extinction. What followed was adaptation. Sometimes the adaptation took generations. Sometimes it was brutal and ugly and came at enormous cost. But they always came through it. And they always came through it having learned something. I had studied 53 first contact species in my career. The pattern I usually saw in history packages was a curve. A species rose, struggled, found some equilibrium, and settled. The curve always flattened. It was how civilizations worked. Humanity's curve did not flatten. It kept climbing. I requested a medical consultation with my ship's physician the next morning. I described no specific symptoms. I simply asked whether prolonged review of unfamiliar historical material could produce a response in our physiology similar to what humans called unease. She told me yes, under certain conditions. I told her I might need a few days before I was ready to continue the negotiations. She asked if I was well. I told her I was not entirely sure. I went back to the window and looked down at the blue and green world below the station. It was a beautiful planet. Calm from this distance. Soft. The kind of world that looked, from orbit, like something gentle lived there. I had spent my entire career learning to read what was below the surface of things. The council trusted me precisely because I was good at that. And standing there looking at that world, something very old and very careful in the part of my mind responsible for threat assessment was sending a signal. It was a quiet signal. Just a low, steady note, like a frequency at the edge of hearing. Not panic. Not certainty. Just the feeling that something I had been told about this place was not quite right, and that it mattered very much that I figure out what it was before I signed anything on behalf of the council. I thought of Yara Solis at the table. Steady hands. Direct eyes. The question she had asked, who decides when the protection ends? I thought, she already knows the answer. She asked to see if we would tell her the truth. I stayed at the window for a long time. Below me, the planet turned slowly in its orbit, blue and green and patient, the way only very old things are patient. I did not sleep much that night. And I told myself it was the unfamiliar atmosphere pressure. I was learning, slowly, to recognize the feeling of being wrong about something important. I just did not yet know how wrong I was, or how large the thing was that I had misunderstood. That would come later. And when it came, it would not come gently. The assignment was supposed to last 3 months. I stayed for 14. The council approved my extended integration without much comment. I told them it was due diligence. I told them a species of this complexity required more observation before final terms could be recommended. Both of those things were true. What I did not tell them was that I was beginning to feel something I had not expected to feel on this assignment, which was the particular discomfort of realizing that everything you thought you understood about a situation was built on a foundation that was quietly wrong. It started with small things, the way it always starts. Yara Solis arranged a tour of what she called representative environments. She said it was so I could understand the full range of where humans lived and worked. I agreed, because observation was my function and because I thought watching humans in their natural settings would give me the data I needed to complete my recommendation. I brought 2 members of my team. We began with the northern forest zones, which were vast and cold and dark in the hours before the local star rose. Yara woke me at what she cheerfully called an unreasonable hour and handed me a cup of a hot dark liquid called coffee, which smelled extremely powerful and tasted like something between medicine and earth. She drank hers in 4 swallows while reviewing something on a small screen. She was already dressed. She had already eaten. When I asked what time she had woken up, she said 4 in the morning with the same casual tone someone uses to describe the weather. We went into the forest before full light. I want to be precise about what happened in that forest, because it is easy to describe it incorrectly and miss the point entirely. Yara did not tell me she was going to demonstrate anything. She did not give a presentation or explain her methods. She simply walked, and I followed, and I watched. She moved differently outside. That was the first thing. On the station, in corridors and meeting rooms, her movements had been measured and contained, the controlled economy of someone performing professionalism. In the forest, something shifted. Not dramatically. She did not become loud or erratic. She became, if anything, quieter. Her steps found softer ground without her looking down. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes moved in a longer, wider pattern, scanning distances rather than surfaces. She read the wind direction by tilting her head slightly, and I watched her adjust her path 2 degrees to the left afterward. I had studied their biology. I knew humans were classified as persistence predators, a hunting strategy based not on speed or strength but on endurance and tracking, following prey over distances until the prey's body gave out before the humans did. I knew this the way you know facts from a report. Standing in that forest in the cold blue hour before sunrise, watching Yara read the treeline with the ease of breathing, I understood it in a completely different way. She was not demonstrating a skill. She was being what she was. At one point she stopped and crouched without a word and looked at the ground for about 30 seconds. Then she stood and changed direction entirely. I asked what she had seen. She pointed at the soil, where I could barely make out the faint press of what I assumed was an animal print. She said the direction it was pointing told her where the animal had gone. She said the depth of it told her roughly how long ago it had passed. She said the pattern of nearby prints told her whether the animal had been moving slowly or quickly. Then she said, "They went north. We'll follow." Neil Hartley, who had joined us and who I had initially assessed as a logistics coordinator, smiled at me when I turned to look at him. "She's been doing this since she was 7, he said. I looked at Yara's back as she moved north without looking back to see if we were following. She knew we were following. "Does she hunt?" I asked. Neil considered the question. "Sometimes," he said. "When she wants to think." I wrote in my notes that evening, humans use predatory behavior as a cognitive tool. This requires further analysis. What I did not write, because I was not yet sure how to categorize it, was the feeling that had settled in me in that forest. It was not fear. It was something quieter and stranger. It was the feeling of standing next to something very capable that was, at this moment, choosing not to demonstrate the full extent of what it could do. The tour continued over the following weeks. Yara took me to a coastal research station where human scientists spent extended periods in deep ocean vessels, diving to depths that would destroy the structural integrity of most standard galactic exploration equipment, doing it in hand-built machines that relied on human engineering and human nerve. I watched a crew briefing before one such dive. The lead diver, a calm woman named Helen Cross, went through the checklist with the methodical ease of someone who had done this so many times that the checklist was formality rather than instruction. I asked Helen afterward if she was concerned about the dive. She looked at me with mild surprise. "About which part?" she asked. I gestured vaguely to indicate all of it. She thought about this for a moment. "I'm careful," she said. "That's different from concerned. I spent an evening reviewing galactic records of other species' exploration patterns. Almost every species expanded from known, comfortable zones outward, in gradual increments, pulling back when danger was encountered, mapping edges before committing. It was sensible. It was what a rational species did. Humans sent individuals into the deepest trenches of their ocean for curiosity. They climbed the highest points of their planet because, as one of the historical records quoted, it is there they sailed across the entire surface of their world in small wooden vessels centuries before they had any reliable navigation technology, not because they needed to, but because they wanted to know what was on the other side. Grace Adler, the engineer who had watched my secondary limbs during the first meeting, invited me to visit the facility where humans were developing their next generation of deep space vessels. She walked me through the design bay with the pride and matter-of-fact certainty of someone showing off something that would obviously work. The ships were large. Much larger than the Council's threat assessment had suggested was possible for a species at this stage of development. I asked how long the program had been running. Grace said, formally, about 30 years. But if you count the people who were doing the math in their garages before that, probably 60. I looked at the ship frames rising in the assembly space and thought about the word garages. In their personal spaces, Grace clarified. At home. In their spare time. For 60 years. People like building things, she said simply, as though this explained everything. And perhaps it did. I sent a second memo to the Council. I described what I had observed with careful, measured language. I recommended upgrading the threat, or rather, the complexity, assessment from Category 2 to pending reclassification. I noted the persistence hunting biology. I noted the deep exploration behavior. I noted the ship development timeline. I noted the quality of Yara's questions in the first meeting. The Council's response came back in 6 days. It was warm, professional, and completely dismissive. They thanked me for my thoroughness. They noted that many pregalactic species showed bursts of technological ambition that stabilized after integration. They encouraged me to proceed with finalizing the protective arrangement. I read the message twice. Then I set it aside. That evening Yara found me on the observation deck of the station, looking at the stars. She brought 2 cups of coffee and handed me one without asking if I wanted it. I had, over the preceding weeks, developed what she called an acquired taste for it. You sent a memo, she said. It was not a question. I did. And they told you not to worry. I looked at her. How do you know that? She smiled, looking out at the stars. Because it is what people in charge of large systems always tell the person on the ground who is noticing something inconvenient. She sipped her coffee. We have a lot of experience with that dynamic. I thought about the historical archives. I thought about the number of times, across their entire recorded history, that humans had been told by whoever held authority that things were fine, the situation was under control, there was nothing to concern themselves with. I thought about what they had done every single time someone told them that. Yara, I said, what would humanity do if the Council's protection arrangement turned out not to be in your interests? She was quiet for a moment. The stars burned very steadily outside the window. We'd manage, she said. Her voice was gentle. But there was something underneath it, not a threat, nothing so blunt as that. Just a certainty. A deep, structural certainty, like the certainty in the ground beneath a mountain. I held my coffee cup and said nothing. The tour lasted 4 more weeks. She took me to the places where they grew food at scale, where they trained their emergency response teams, where they ran the simulations for scenarios nobody hoped would happen but everyone quietly prepared for. In every place, I saw the same thing I had seen in the forest. A species that planned. A species that thought about what came next, and next after that, and what would happen if the thing after that went wrong. They were not afraid of difficulty. They were interested in it. There was a word their engineers used constantly, problem, and the way they said it, with the slight lean forward, with the brightening of attention, told me everything about how they related to obstacles. A problem was not a wall. A problem was an invitation. On my last evening before returning to Council space to file my report, Yara walked me to the docking corridor. She stopped at the threshold, where the station's light fell off into the dark mouth of the umbilical passage. Come back, she said. The coffee will still be here. I told her I would recommend a full reclassification review. She nodded once, as if she had expected this. Then she held out her hand again, and I shook it, and this time I was ready for the grip and it still surprised me. Zailrin, she said, as I stepped into the passage, whatever the Council decides, we'll be fine. We always are. I walked to the ship. I did not look back, but I could feel the certainty of her standing there, calm and steady, watching me go. And I thought of every forest and every ocean depth and every garage and every ship frame and every question she had asked that first day at the table. I thought, I do not think the council understands what they are dealing with. And then, for the first time in a long career of measured, professional observation, I thought something that was not in any assessment report, not in any council guideline, not in any framework I had ever been trained to use. I thought, I hope, when this matters, that they are on my side. The transmission arrived at Council Station Oriath on a Tuesday morning, which meant nothing to me because I did not track human days, but Yara told me the day afterward, and for some reason the ordinariness of it stayed with me. Tuesday. A regular day. The kind of day on which, in their history, all the large things seem to happen. I was in my office completing the final sections of my reclassification report when my aide knocked and entered with the look that meant something had moved faster than expected. The Keth Dominion has raided a human settlement, he said. A colony called Calder's Rest. Outer edge of the settled boundary. I set down my work. Casualties. Significant property loss. 41 humans taken as captives. I knew the Keth's pattern. Every species watcher in the council knew it. They were a mid-tier dominion that had built their position not through exceptional technology or diplomacy but through a specific and very old tactic. Find a new species. Strike a soft target on the edge of their claimed space. Take hostages. Deliver a demand. Let the shock of the attack and the fear for the captives do the rest. The target species, overwhelmed and unprepared for this kind of sudden pressure, would agree to almost any terms to get their people back. The Keth would extract a long-term resource arrangement, a territorial concession, and a formal acknowledgement of their superiority. Then they would disappear and leave the broken species to process what had just happened. They had done this 38 times in the past 2 centuries. 38 times, it had worked exactly as described. I stood up from my desk. What does the human response look like? My aide hesitated. That is why I came immediately. He handed me the transmission record. I read it standing, because somehow sitting felt wrong. Yara had not sent the message herself. It came from a human communications office I had not dealt with before, a department called Strategic Coordination, which had not appeared in any of the briefing materials the council provided. The message was 5 sentences long. The first sentence acknowledged the raid on Calder's Rest. The second sentence stated that the 41 captives would be recovered. The third sentence informed the Keth Dominion that a human response fleet had been dispatched, not to Calder's Rest, not to the raid site, but to Keth Prime, the Dominion's home system. The fourth sentence extended an offer: if the captives were returned unharmed within 72 hours, the fleet would stand down. The fifth sentence stated that if the offer was not accepted, the fleet would arrive at Keth Prime in approximately 4 days, and they would prefer to negotiate before that happened. The transmission was signed not by Yara, but by someone called Admiral Paul Graves, commander of the Earth Defense Coordination Force. I had not known that Earth had an admiral. I had not known they had a defense coordination force. I sat down after all. The council chamber erupted, and I mean this with complete accuracy. The representatives of 11 founding species were all speaking at once, which is an extraordinary thing to witness because several of them communicate on frequencies humans cannot hear, and the overlapping noise of it was genuinely difficult to process. The alarm was unanimous. The Keth were an established power. Any direct action against Keth Prime by a pre-integration species was considered an act that could destabilize an entire sector. There were protocols. There were procedures. There was a proper order of escalation that had been designed specifically to prevent exactly this kind of direct confrontation. The council wanted to intervene. They wanted to contact both parties, establish a mediation process, and prevent what they were already calling an incident. I asked for the floor. I got it because I was the Earth specialist, and at this particular moment everyone wanted the Earth specialist to explain what was happening. The humans are not asking for our intervention, I said. And I want to suggest that offering it without being asked may be a significant mistake. Silence, which in an 11-species chamber is equally impossible to describe. The council representative from the Varesh Collective, a being of considerable experience and very little patience for what she considered naive analysis, asked me why. I said, because if we intervene now, we teach them that the council's first response to human initiative is to stop them. And I do not think this species responds well to being stopped. The Varesh representative asked what I thought would happen if we did not intervene. I think they will retrieve their people, I said. And I think the Keth will let them. On what basis? She demanded. I thought of the forest. I thought of the ships in the assembly bay. I thought of Helen Cross's face when I asked if she was concerned about the dive, and how she had said, "Careful." That's different from concerned. On the basis, I said carefully, that I have spent 14 months watching this species, and I have not once seen them commit to a course of action they were not prepared to complete. The chamber did not go quiet. It got louder. But the council, after considerable debate, agreed to observe rather than intervene. It was the most reluctant agreement I had ever witnessed, and it was made primarily because no one had a good answer to my question, which was, if we try to stop them, and they do not stop, what do we do next? Nobody wanted to answer that question. I stayed in the situation room for the next 4 days. I did not sleep much. I tracked what information came in through standard monitoring channels and tried to build a picture of what was actually happening in the space between Earth's fleet and Keth Prime. On the second day, a transmission came from the Keth Dominion to the Galactic Council. It was longer than human messages tended to be, and its tone was very different from the clipped certainty of Paul Graves. The Keth were asking, in the formal diplomatic language of a party that would not admit alarm but was clearly alarmed, whether the Council intended to rein in what they described as the unprovoked aggression of the primitive Earth species. I drafted the Council's response myself, with approval from the senior chamber. We are observing the situation. On the third day, a second Keth transmission arrived. Shorter this time. They asked whether the Council was aware of the size of the human fleet approaching Keth Prime. I had access to the monitoring data. I was aware. I had not included the fleet size in my briefing to the Council because I had needed a moment to process it myself. The human fleet was larger than anything the Council's threat assessment had predicted was possible for a species at their stage of development. Not marginally larger. Substantially larger. And it was organized with a precision that spoke of planning that had not begun last week, or last month, or even last year. This had been thought through. This had been prepared. The routes, the formation, the communication blackout they were maintaining, all of it had the quality of something that had been rehearsed. I thought of Grace Adler saying, if you count the people doing the math at home, probably 60 years. On the fourth day, at approximately 14 hours before the fleet's projected arrival at Keth Prime, the Keth Dominion released all 41 human captives via an unmanned transport vessel directed toward the nearest neutral waypoint. The transport was accompanied by a message to Earth Strategic Coordination Office that was 6 words long in translation: "We accept your offer. Stand down." Paul Graves' response was 4 words: "Fleet is standing down." The humans turned around and went home. I stood in the situation room and watched the fleet indicators turn and recede on the monitoring display and thought, that was not the reaction of a species that had improvised. That was the reaction of a species that had known exactly how much pressure to apply, applied it with perfect control, and stopped the moment it was no longer necessary. I thought of Yara's voice on the observation deck. We'd manage. I asked my aide to get me the full battle logs from the fleet's deployment. He looked uncertain and asked whether we had authorization to access that level of human operational detail. I told him the humans had not classified it. He checked. They had not. The entire operational record was in their open communications archive, accessible to any party with basic receiver technology. I read through the logs that evening. I want to describe what I found there, because it is important. It is not exciting in the way a recording of an action might be. It is exciting in a different and, I think, more significant way. The logs showed not just what the fleet did, but the decisions, the contingency branches, the pre-prepared responses to dozens of different possible Keth reactions. If the Keth had stood firm. If they had called what they believed was a bluff. If they had attempted to engage the fleet before it reached the home system. If they had sent a counter-demand. Every branch had a prepared human response, detailed and specific. They had not improvised a single moment of it. But here is what stayed with me longest, reading those logs alone in the situation room long after everyone else had gone home. One of the contingency files was labeled, "If captives are harmed." I opened it. I read it. I closed it. I sat with it for a long time. The plan in that file was not disproportionate in the way that an emotional or panicked response is disproportionate. It was precise. It was measured. It was the exact level of response necessary to make a clear and permanent point, no more and no less. It had been written with the same calm, thorough precision as every other branch in the file. A species that prepares that specific contingency in that specific way is a species that has thought very carefully about what it is willing to do and what it is capable of doing, and has made peace with the answer. The Keth sent no more transmissions to Earth. They sent one to the Council, requesting clarification on the human species' official status. They used language that, translated, meant something between asking how dangerous something is and asking whether it is safe to be near it. The Council held a classified session to discuss the question. I was not invited, because I was not a Council member, only a specialist. My aide attended as a note-keeper and told me afterward that the session had been long and tense and that the primary difficulty was that nobody had a clean category to put the humans in. They were not an aggressive species. Nothing in their behavior toward the galactic community had been hostile. Yara's team was still, even now, engaged in patient and professional negotiation over the original integration terms. But they were not a passive species either. They were not a species that waited for someone else to solve their problems. They were not a species that measured their response by what they thought they were allowed to do. They measured it by what they thought was right, and then they did exactly that, and they did it with a capability that nobody had seen coming because everybody had been looking at the surface. The Council's session ended without a resolution. They agreed to continue observing. I went back to my office and looked at my unfinished reclassification report. I deleted most of what I had written. I started again from the beginning, this time without the framework the Council had given me, without the category system, without the threat index. I started with a blank document and wrote, at the top, what I actually know about humanity. It was, I discovered, considerably more than the Council thought I knew, and considerably less than I needed. But it was a start. And for the first time since this assignment began, I had the feeling that I was working from something true. I thought of 41 people coming home. I thought of a fleet that turned around the moment it was no longer necessary. I thought, they didn't want to fight. They wanted their people back. And I thought, those are very different things, and the difference tells you everything. The archive was cold. Not physically, the Council's deep records facility maintained a standard temperature appropriate for its various organic users. It was cold in another way. The way that old places are cold when they have held too many secrets for too long and the weight of that knowledge has settled into the walls. I had requested access 3 times before the Council granted it. The first 2 requests were declined without explanation. The third was granted after I submitted a formal research necessity declaration and agreed to log every document I accessed. I agreed without hesitation. I had nothing to hide. What I suspected I would find was something the Council had not hidden, exactly, had simply allowed to become forgotten. The archive was maintained on a station outside standard travel lanes, staffed by a small team of record specialists whose primary qualification seemed to be an ability to tolerate extreme isolation. One of them, a quiet being called Sret, met me at the entry and explained the access protocols without much conversation. Sret had the manner of someone who spent most of their time with documents rather than people and found this entirely satisfactory. I thanked Sret and went to work. The Council's original survey of Earth had been conducted approximately 80,000 years ago, by a team affiliated with a survey organization that no longer existed in its original form. The records from that period were stored on physical media, a format so old that the facility had to provide me with a special reader. I sat in a small, dim room and read. The survey was thorough. The team had observed from a careful distance, in the tradition of early galactic explorers who understood that observation without intervention was the most honest way to gather information. They had documented the human species at what was clearly an early stage of development, small populations, limited tool use, no permanent structures of significant size. Categorized correctly for that period. But the final section of the survey report was flagged. The flag had been placed there by the team's lead analyst, a name I could not pronounce in any of the standard galactic languages but which transliterated roughly as the one who counts. The analyst had written something that, 80,000 years later, sat in that small cold room with me like a voice from a very long time ago. The note read, bipedal persistence predators. Endurance-based hunting strategy confirmed. Unique biological feature, does not stop when injured in the way prey species stop. Continues. Recommend close observation. Do not approach as though they are prey. They are not. They have never been. The ecological niche they occupy on their world is predator, and the behavioral framework that goes with that niche is fully present. They are early, not simple. Recommend long-term monitoring status. Advise, do not make the mistake of the categories. Do not make the mistake of the categories. I read this line several times. Then I looked at the flag status. The flag had been reviewed by a Council Records Committee approximately 30,000 years ago. The committee had downgraded the flag from active to archived. In the notes for the downgrade, a committee member had written, "Survey team appears to have overstated developmental complexity based on limited observational data." Reclassified as Category 2, Emerging, Standard. 30,000 years ago, someone had looked at a warning written by a careful analyst who had spent months watching humanity and said, "No, we think you are overreacting." I closed that file and opened another. It took me 3 days of searching to find what I was looking for, because it had been filed in a category labeled Miscellaneous First Contact Historical Records, a category so broad that it functioned, effectively, as a place where inconvenient things could be stored without being destroyed. The Council had, over its long history, maintained a genuine commitment to preserving records even when those records were uncomfortable. I give them credit for that. What I found, spread across 6 separate entries from 4 different eras, was a pattern. 7 different civilizations, all significantly older than the current Galactic Council, had visited Earth at various points across human prehistory. None of them had made formal contact. Each survey had ended at the observation stage. And each record, written in entirely different languages, from entirely different species, with entirely different cultural frameworks, had arrived at a variation of the same conclusion. The first, from a species the records identified only as the old shapers, now extinct, anomalous adaptive capacity. Biological threat markers present in currently non-threatening form. Do not underestimate. Advise observation only. The second, from a civilization called the Deep Chorus, species demonstrates coordinated group response to threat that exceeds biological expectation. Recommend distance maintained until development stage better understood. The third, from a very old archive associated with a species called the Vreth, now also extinct, do not engage. We made contact in error. We believed them to be early stage. They are not early stage. They are patient stage. There is a significant difference. Our mission is ending its reporting. The Vreth report ended there. There was no subsequent Vreth report from Earth. There was no subsequent Vreth report from anywhere. The Vreth's own records indicated they had experienced significant internal crisis around the same period, the nature of which was not fully documented. What remained of their archive simply stopped, the way a recording stops when someone turns it off in the middle of a sentence. I thought about the word patient stage. I thought about 14 months of watching Yara Solis. I thought about the fleet that turned around the moment the job was done. Patient stage. I understood, sitting in that cold room, what the Vreth analyst had meant. There is a category of species that seems limited because it is early, and there is a different category that seems limited because it is waiting. The first category is genuinely limited. The second category is something else entirely. The second category knows what it has and has made a long, considered decision about when to use it. I found the 6th record on my last evening in the archive. It was from a civilization called the Marin, whose current descendants were associate members of the Galactic Council, a quiet, thoughtful species that maintained their position in council affairs with great diplomatic skill and very little noise. The Marin had visited Earth approximately 20,000 years ago, at a period when humans were beginning to develop the first organized settlements. The Marin survey report was the longest of the 6. The Marin were, by nature, careful and detailed observers. They had watched from orbit for 8 months before concluding their survey. Their final report ran to several hundred pages, and I did not have time to read all of it, but I read the conclusion. The conclusion said, "This species will reach the stars." This is not a prediction in the ordinary sense, it is an observation of direction. They are moving toward space capability with the same consistency that they move toward every other frontier. There is no evidence that they will stop. There is significant evidence that they are incapable of stopping, not due to lack of intelligence or restraint, but due to something in the core structure of what they are. They are oriented toward the unknown the way some biological organisms are oriented toward light. It is not a choice. It is what they are. When they arrive, the galactic community will need to make a decision about how to regard them. Our recommendation is this: do not make the decision based on what they look like. Make it based on what they do. And when assessing what they do, account for what they choose not to do. The restraint is as significant as the capability. Possibly more so. I set the reader down and sat in the dim room for a long time. The Marin had said all of this 20,000 years ago. The Council had filed it under miscellaneous. I thought about my reclassification report, waiting on my desk back at the station. I thought about how many times, in how many careful clinical words, I had been trying to say what the Marin had said in one clear, direct paragraph. Account for what they choose not to do. The restraint is as significant as the capability. I gathered my access logs, thanked Sret at the exit, and began the journey back. On the ship, I sat down at my desk and opened a direct communication channel, not to the council, not to my aide, not to any official address. I called Yara. She answered on the second signal, which told me she was awake, which given the time difference meant she had been awake for several hours already. She was at her desk. There was coffee. Zailrin, she said. You look like you found something. I found several things, I said. I want to tell you something that the council will not be pleased I am telling you. She waited. Steady. We knew, I said. Not this council, not these specific individuals, but the galactic community. There have been surveys. There have been reports. For 80,000 years, people who looked at your species carefully came back and said, be careful. This is not what it appears to be. And every time, the formal record decided they were overreacting. Yara was quiet for a moment. 80,000 years, she said. Yes. She looked at something on her desk that I could not see. Then she looked back at the screen. What changed? Why is this the contact that stuck? I thought about this. I had been thinking about it since the archive. I think, I said slowly, because this time you came to us. Every other survey was us going to you. And it is easier to underestimate something that does not move toward you. Once you moved toward us, once you were in our space, asking your questions, refusing our terms without revision, it was harder to file it away. Yara nodded slowly. Then she said, we thought you were prey, I tell her. There is a pause. Then she says, gently, we know. We let you. I stopped. What did you say? She looked at me directly. We knew, Zailrin. Not every detail. Not the specific files or the specific eras. But we could see it in every interaction. The way the council structured its offer. The protection arrangement, who controls it, who decides when it applies, who has no real voice in its operation. We could see that the community looking at us had decided, somewhere, that we needed to be managed rather than engaged. We let it be because there is a kind of information you can only get by watching people act on wrong assumptions. We wanted to know what you thought we were before we told you what we actually are. I sat with that for a long moment. And now, I asked. Now you know, she said. And now we can actually talk. I thought about everything in those archives. I thought about the Vreth. I thought about the old analyst who had written do not make the mistake of the categories 8,000 centuries ago. Are you angry? I asked. That it took this long. That so many people looked and looked away. She picked up her coffee. We're used to being underestimated, she said. It is honestly more useful than the alternative, she paused. The question now is what you do with what you know. What does your report say? My report, I said, is going to say something the council has never read before in a formal specialist recommendation. She waited. It is going to say that humanity does not fit any existing category. It is going to say that the proper framework for engaging with humanity is not the protection model or the trade model or the integration model. It is going to say that the only appropriate framework is one that starts from the acknowledgement that we are dealing with an equal. Possibly, in certain respects, with something that is more than that. Yara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, they will not like that. I know. Are you going to write it anyway? Yes, I said. She smiled. It was the same smile from the first corridor, the patient one I had not understood then. I understood it now. Good, she said. We will be interested to read it. I closed the channel and looked at the blank document on my screen. I began to type. And this time I did not stop. I stood before the full council chamber and delivered my report without notes. I had rehearsed it, but not because I needed help remembering. I rehearsed it because I wanted to be certain that every word was the right word, that nothing in my language or pacing could be dismissed as imprecision or emotion. I had spent 4 weeks writing the report and 3 more reviewing it. I had asked my aide to read it and tell me where the weaknesses were. He had come back with very few corrections, which told me either that it was very good or that he was afraid to push back, and I chose to believe the former because I needed to. The chamber held all 11 founding species and the 12 associate representatives. There were also, by special arrangement, 3 human observers in the upper gallery, Yara Solis, Grace Adler, and a man I had not met before named Oliver Marsh, who had the still, observant quality of someone who spent his professional life assessing situations rather than reacting to them. I learned later he was a senior analyst with Earth Strategic Coordination Office. I had not told the council the humans would be present. They discovered it when they entered the chamber. Several representatives were visibly displeased. I had documented this reaction in my notes because it told me something useful about the council's default position that I wanted on record. I began by telling the chamber that I was going to recommend something they had never been asked to vote on before. I had their attention. I told them that in my 14 months of direct observation, my 4 days in the Situation Room during the Keth incident, and my full review of the historical archive records, I had arrived at a conclusion that I was confident was correct and that they were not going to find comfortable. Humanity was not a Category 2 species. Humanity was not a Category 1 species. Humanity was not, in fact, a Category anything species. The category system, I said, had been designed by the founding members of the Council to organize species based on their assessed capability and threat level, and it had served that purpose well for most of its history. It had failed in the case of humanity not because the system was poorly designed but because it was designed with a specific assumption built into it, that a species was either developing or developed, either limited or capable, and that the position on that scale could be read from surface indicators, technology level, population spread, resource consumption, military capability as observed. The assumption was wrong. I then walked them through what I had found. Not in summaries, not in careful diplomatic softening, but in full detail. The 80,000-year survey flag that had been downgraded by a committee that had not done the observation themselves. The 6 records from other civilizations, each one a version of the same warning, each one filed and forgotten. The Marin report that said exactly what needed to be said 20,000 years ago and had been labeled miscellaneous. The Vreth. I let the chamber sit with the Vreth entry for longer than was strictly necessary, because I thought they should. Then I described what I had personally observed. I was precise. I used specific dates, specific incidents, specific words from specific conversations. The forest and how Yara moved in it. The fleet that turned around the moment the captives were free. The contingency file I had read. Helen Cross's face when she said careful is different from concerned. Grace Adler's 60 years of people doing math in their garages. The questions Yara had asked in the first meeting, and what those questions revealed about the quality of thinking underneath them. And then I told them what Yara had said to me on the communication channel 4 weeks ago, with her coffee and her steady voice. We knew. We let you. The chamber was very quiet when I finished that section. I let the quiet sit. Then I said, humanity is not prey. They have never been prey. They are what their own planet shaped them to be over millions of years, a persistence predator of extraordinary capability, which means they do not overpower obstacles, they outlast them, which means they do not stop when injured or discouraged or vastly outnumbered, they adapt and continue. They survived everything their own planet put in front of them before they ever looked at the sky. They survived everything they put in front of each other, which was, I want to note for the record, considerably worse than anything we have presented to them. They reached us not in spite of all of that but because of all of it. But here is what the categories missed, I said. Here is what every survey that came back with a warning was trying to say. The capability is not the significant thing. The significant thing is what they have chosen to do with the capability. I watched this species for over a year. I watched them send a fleet to the edge of another civilization's home system and turn it around the moment the job was done. Not because they had to. Because they chose to. I watched them offer trade terms and sit through patronizing presentations and review documents with patience and courtesy they did not owe anyone. Not because they were afraid. Because they had decided that patience was worth it. I said, the Marin report from 20,000 years ago concluded that the restraint was as significant as the capability. Possibly more so. I agree. I would go further. I think the restraint is the most significant thing about humanity. Because the capability is something they were born with, through biology and evolution and the simple hard pressure of surviving on a very demanding world. But the restraint is something they built. It is a choice they make, collectively, every day, in the full knowledge of what they could do instead. A species that knows what it is and works that hard to be something more than only that is not something you manage. It is not something you put in a category and file and check on periodically. It is something you sit across from, with full honesty, and ask what kind of relationship they are willing to build. I recommended a Category Omega designation. The designation had existed in the Council's formal classification system for the entirety of the Council's history and had never been used. It had been created as a theoretical placeholder for an entity that did not fit the existing spectrum. Its formal definition was an open classification, pending genuine engagement. I recommended that the protective arrangement be withdrawn and replaced with a mutual partnership framework, in which humanity's council representation was not advisory but full voting. I recommended that the historical archive be formally unsealed and shared in its entirety with the human delegation, including all 6 of the older civilization records. And then I said something that was not in the written report, because I had decided it only in the previous night and had not had time to put it in formal language, and because I thought the council would respond better to hearing it spoken in the chamber than reading it on a document. I said, I think they let us believe what we believed because they needed to know if we were capable of honesty. I think the entire integration process, from the moment Yara Solis shook my hand in that corridor, has been as much an assessment of us as it was meant to be an assessment of them. And I think we have been, on balance, not quite good enough. We were not dishonest, exactly. We did not intend harm. But we underestimated them based on categories we made up and then forgot we made up. We filed warnings written by careful observers because they were inconvenient. We offered protection with one hand and control with the other and called it generosity. We should have done better. We can do better now. But it will require us to understand that the relationship going forward is not one in which we are the adults in the room. It is one in which we have finally, about 80,000 years late, introduced ourselves properly. The chamber was silent for a long time after I sat down. The first vote was called after 3 hours of debate, most of which I will not describe here because much of it was the ordinary sounds of institutions adjusting their self-image, which is never a graceful process and rarely a quick one. There were representatives who insisted the fleet action was a threatening display. There were representatives who worried about what full partnership status would mean for existing council power structures. There were long discussions about precedent and about what other species would expect if they saw humanity receive terms that had never been offered to anyone else. I answered every question with the same patience I had been learning, slowly, over 14 months of watching a species that had it in ways I would never fully match. The final vote was 7-4 in favor of Category Omega status and preliminary partnership framework negotiation. It was not unanimous. It was not what I would have written if I had been writing the vote. But it was real, and it was a start, and starts are what matter. I looked up at the gallery when the count was announced. Oliver Marsh had not moved during the entire session. Yara's expression had not changed through 3 hours of debate. Grace Adler was writing something in a small book she carried, not a screen, an actual book with pages, and she kept writing for a moment after the vote before she looked up. When Yara caught my eye, she did not smile. She simply nodded once, the same nod she had given me in the first meeting, when I had told her the arrangement would require review. A nod that said, yes. This is how it goes. We will continue. The session ended. The chamber emptied. I sat for a while in my chair as the light in the room shifted toward the dimmer setting that followed formal sessions, the council's version of drawing breath. After some time, I heard footsteps. Yara Solis came down from the gallery and walked along the aisle between the council seats and sat in the chair next to mine, which was not a human chair and did not fit her comfortably, and did not seem to bother her at all. 7-4, she said. Yes. That's better than I expected, she said. I looked at her. What did you expect? 5-6, honestly. The Varesh representative's body language shifted about 90 minutes in. I wasn't sure which way she was going to go until she voted. I thought about the fact that Yara had been reading the body language of 11 different alien species from an upper gallery for 3 hours. We are going to need to share the archive records with you, I said. All of them. Including the Vreth. She nodded. We'd like that. It is not a comfortable read. We've had worse, she said easily. Then, after a pause, I want to say something to you, Zael Rin, that I want you to take as something genuine rather than diplomatic. I waited. You didn't have to do it the way you did it, she said. You could have written a report that was careful and measured and protected your position with the council and still moved things in the right direction. Slowly. You didn't do that. You stood up in that room and told an 11-species body that they had been wrong for 80,000 years and that it was time to do better, and you did it in front of us, which was a risk, and in front of them, which was a bigger one. She paused. That took something. I thought about the archive. I thought about the analyst who had written "Do not make the mistake of the categories" and had their work filed under miscellaneous for 30,000 years. Someone should have said it a long time ago, I said. Yes, Yara said. But they didn't. You did. That's what counts. We sat in the quiet chamber for a while without speaking. The council building had a hum to it when it was empty: ventilation, power flow, the ordinary sounds of a very old institution doing its endless maintenance of itself. I had sat in this chamber dozens of times in my career and never once noticed that hum. I noticed it now because the room was genuinely quiet and I was genuinely still, which was not a state I had been in very much recently. What comes next? I asked. Negotiation, Yara said. Real negotiation. The kind where both parties have to give things up and neither party gets everything they wanted. It will take a long time and it will be frustrating and there will be points where it almost falls apart. She paused. That's fine. We're patient. I thought about 60 years of people doing math in their garages. I thought about the analyst writing 8,000 centuries ago in the cold records of a survey that nobody would read for a very long time. I thought about the endurance hunters in the forest, following the print in the soil because they had decided to and because they had decided was enough. Yara, I said, when you shook my hand in that corridor on the first day, what were you thinking? She considered this. I was thinking that you seemed like someone who was actually paying attention, she said. And that was going to matter. She stood up. She stretched in the particular way humans stretched after sitting too long, with a slight sound of effort that she did not seem embarrassed by. Then she held out her hand. I shook it. The grip was exactly as strong as the first time. Come to Earth, she said. Stay for a while. There's a lot we haven't shown you yet. I told her I had already requested a transfer to the permanent Earth liaison post. She looked pleased. Good, she said. Grace will want to show you the new ships. Helen Cross is taking a vessel to the Outer Trench system in 3 months. She'll invite you if you ask. And I have a dog who needs someone to take him walking at 4 in the morning because nobody else in the building will do it at that hour. I thought of the archive room and the cold records and the long wait of everything that had been misunderstood for so long. I thought of the blue and green planet from orbit, calm and patient, the way only very old things are patient. I'll take the walks, I said. She nodded, satisfied, and walked out of the council chamber. I sat alone for a few minutes more. Outside the tall windows, the station's running lights cast long patterns across the docking ring, and beyond that the stars were the same stars they had always been, indifferent to category systems and reclassifications and long overdue conversations. Somewhere out there, 80,000 years of missed understanding were being quietly archived. And here, in this room, something else was beginning, slower than I would have liked, noisier than anyone had hoped, but real. Real is what mattered. I gathered my documents and walked out of the chamber, into the corridor, toward whatever came next. Behind me, the lights dimmed to their overnight setting, and the hum of the building continued, steady and unhurried, keeping time the way institutions do, in decades rather than moments, in long patience rather than quick resolution. It occurred to me, walking, that I had learned something in 14 months that I had not been sent to learn, something the council had not asked me to find, something that none of the 60 surveys across 80,000 years had fully captured in their careful distant notes. Humanity was not dangerous because of what they could do. They were extraordinary because of what they chose. Every day. In full knowledge of the alternative. In the clear sight of what they were and what they had always been. They chose to build something better, not because it was easy, not because the galaxy had been kind or welcoming or honest with them, but because they had decided it was worth building, and once they decided something was worth doing, they did not stop. I stepped out into the station's main corridor. Somewhere ahead of me was a ship, and beyond that a blue and green planet, and somewhere on that planet at 4 in the morning, a dog was waiting for someone to take it walking. I was, for the first time in a very long career, exactly where I was supposed to be. And I was, for the first time in a very long life, not entirely sure what was going to happen next. I could not wait to find out.